Hello and welcome to the Majlis podcast, Radio for Reputed Liberties Current Affairs talk show focusing on Central Asia. I'm Muhammad Tahir, host of the Majlis and Radio for Reputed Liberties Media Manager here in Washington, D.C. As the Afghan government collapsed last week in Kabul and the Taliban continue to solidify its grip on power, the world is watching with horror the chaotic scenes at the airport of people desperately trying to flee from what might be in store for them. Hundreds of Afghans, particularly government employees and high-profile leaders from northern Afghanistan have reportedly gone to Central Asia. Tajikistan is preparing for more people to come, and Uzbekistan is already hosting at least 1,500 Afghans. We understand some of them were sent back to Afghanistan, but what about the high-profile leaders, servicemen whose life could be at risk if sent back? Where they are, what is the plan for them? So the bottom line is, as Bruce Pannier states in his recent piece, the events that the governments of Tajikistan, Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan have been increasingly dreading in recent weeks have finally begun to happen. As the situation remains uncertain, it seems that hoping for the best, Central Asia is kind of preparing for the worst. So in this episode of Majlis podcast, we are here to discuss what has been happening at the border since the collapse of the Afghan government and what's the Central Asia is preparing for as to what comes next. To discuss all these, I'm joined by Dr. Erika Marat, Assistant Professor at the National Defense University in Washington, D.C. Dr. Marat is originally from Kyrgyzstan. Pahlawan Turgunov, the Managing Editor of Radio for Reputed Liberties Uzbek Service, locally known as Ozotlik. Kayu Mars Otto, a journalist with Radio for Reputed Liberties Tajik Service, locally known as Rodioy Azadi. And Bruce Pannier, the Editor of Radio for Reputed Liberties Central Asia blog, Kishlok Owazi. Thank you, colleagues, for joining us today. So, since we discussed this topic just 2 weeks ago on this platform, there has been a sea change in Afghanistan, government collapse. The Tajik and ethnic Uzbek leaders from Afghanistan who were aiming to stop the Taliban's advance in the north have fled to Central Asia along with hundreds of the Afghan servicemen. So now the Taliban is next neighbor for Central Asia. So Pahlawan, let's start with you. The latest news from Uzbekistan is that there are around 1,500 Afghan refugees already in the country. This was reported citing the Afghan embassy staffer in Tashkent. Tell us, please, when did all these people come and what the authorities in Uzbekistan are saying about this?
Well, officially, according to official information, there are currently 100 refugees and a few hundred members of the former Afghan security forces who crossed the border illegally, as it's said in the official statement, and who are being held separately from the refugees. We don't know how the situation will unfold in the near future, but Uzbek government did not put any numbers, did not give any numbers on the refugees it could take. And on July 22nd, Uzbek Foreign Minister, Special Envoy to Afghanistan, Ismatullah Ergashev, said that there was no legal basis to host refugees, which means they are not keen to accept any refugees from Afghanistan. On the other hand, we know that Uzbekistan or any other Central Asian country is not a popular place among Afghans to seek refuge. We've seen pictures of Dostum and others crossing the Khayratan Bridge on the Uzbek border. The situation remained calm the next day, and though there is limited information available regarding to the fate of those fleeing the Taliban, it seems the government has managed to keep the refugees at the border. I think Uzbekistan has learned lessons from previous interactions with the Taliban. I remember talking to former high-ranking official from the Uzbek Defense Ministry back in 2001, who told me that when the Taliban first reached the Uzbek border in 1996, President Karim found out through Russian media at the time, as opposed to his own team, and he consequently sacked the entire military intelligence unit within the defense ministry. I think they seem to be better prepared for the Taliban's comeback this time round.
Pahlawan, just to clarify a little bit, I have seen the number 84 people being detained, Afghans being detained in Uzbekistan. And you also mentioned that authorities in Uzbekistan acknowledge that there are around 100 Afghans who have illegally crossed into Uzbekistan. That's the only thing they acknowledge at the moment in terms of Afghans coming into Uzbekistan?
Yes, on 14th of August, when Mazar-e Sharif was abandoned by the security forces and Afghan army, they gave the number of 84. I mean, we understood that they were the members of security forces. And then they said 100 Afghans, I believe they are ordinary refugees, were placed in the camp somewhere on the border area in Termiz. And then there were also 585 members of Afghan security forces who, as said in the official report, who crossed the border illegally and who are currently being held at the COVID center somewhere in Termiz. I think there is being questioned or quarantined by the Uzbek side, but it was said they were regarded as someone who crossed the border illegally. I mean, I think Uzbek security services are dealing with that. And then they denied the Marshal Dostum and Atanur Muhammad, kind of former Northern Alliance leaders, were in Uzbekistan. They officially denied that information.
Very interesting. Yeah, the Uzbekistan's position is very interesting. I think we should talk about this a little bit more. There were a couple of statements that I've been looking at when I was preparing for this discussion, like some numbers, they would say 84 people have crossed and they are in detention centers. And also in other statement, they would say there were people at the Hayraton crossing and they have willingly gone back to Afghanistan. I cannot comprehend this situation, how they willingly go back when people are so desperate to escape the country, even at the cost of falling from the airplane at the Kabul airport, these horrific scenes that everyone has seen. This position is kind of very, very interesting. Bruce, I would like to take your point on that a little bit later. But before, on Tajikistan, Kayomis, the military after military planes have been landing to Tajikistan and also to Uzbekistan, although authorities seem to be not acknowledging that. What is the latest from Tajikistan? Who are there? How many people are there? And what's going on with those people who have entered to Tajikistan?
There is only one report about refugees from Afghanistan to Tajikistan since the Taliban fighters entered Kabul. According to our sources, 143 people, especially Afghan authorities, two of them women, arrived to Tajikistan on the night of August 15th in 3 planes and 2 helicopters. Our sources told the Tajik authorities handed over more than 50 items of small arms from them and housed at the dormitory of university in Khatno region. Khatno region is southern part of Tajikistan near the border of Afghanistan. Some media reported about 18 planes arrived from Afghanistan to Tajikistan, but Tajik officials denied this. They confirmed only arrival of 2 planes and said that the planes are returned to Afghanistan. We asked about it from Afghan ambassador to Tajikistan, Zahir Akbar too, on 18th of August. He had a press conference in Dushanbe. He answered don't know real numbers of planes and also refugees or who authorities escaped in Tajikistan. There are no reports about civilian refugees from Afghanistan to Tajikistan, but a month ago, authorities announced the arrival of hundreds of refugees from Afghanistan. According to our information, they are now in Badakhshan region in the western part of Tajikistan. We know, our reporters in Dushanbe talked with some of refugees in Dushanbe city and the capital of Tajikistan. One of them reported independent TV station in Afghanistan, Ordu TV, and the other was a Sikh woman. Of course, they also said they had moved to Tajikistan before the Taliban entered in Kabul. In any, as you know, the Tajik authorities have expressed they are ready to accept refugees from Afghanistan.
Yeah, so they are ready, but do you mean those refugees are not coming or what? You are just talking about 140 people at this moment, and most of them, as you say, are the servicemen or officials, former officials.
We have information about 143 people, especially Afghan authorities. Yes.
Now, what about the ordinary people like refugees? They are not coming. As you say, as we heard in the past, like Tajikistan is preparing for hundreds of thousands of people to come to the border and they are getting ready to host them. No one is coming there?
First of all, I need to say, after the fall of Kabul and the return of the Taliban to power in Afghanistan after 20 years, as you know, Tajik government have not yet commented officially on the recent happening or recent events in Afghanistan, also about the situation in the border and about refugees. They didn't any official statement or announcement about the situation in the border, about refugees, Afghan refugees. We don't know really. Our sources told about 143 people.
About those high-profile people, I can count a couple of them at least, like Atanur, Dostum, and his immediate associates. They have gone to somewhere. Where they have gone then? I mean, authorities in Uzbekistan say they are not there, and Tajikistan is not saying anything. I mean, they have gone to somewhere. I mean, we thought that they are in Uzbekistan. Some of them are in Tajikistan. Bruce, where they have gone to?
Well, that is a good question. I mean, certainly, or almost certainly, they went through Uzbekistan to start with. I mean, let's face it, especially in Dostum's case, that would have been like the third time that he's had to flee the north. And the previous two times in the late 90s, he went through Uzbekistan. So I think that's a fair bet. It's pretty well known that he actually has a home in Termez. Where he is now, that's a good question. Ata Muhammad Noor, I don't know. He probably went through there too, but where he is, I mean, I've even heard that he made his way to the Panjshir Valley somehow or another. But Dostum is a big question. You can understand why the Uzbek government wouldn't want to broadcast that even if he was there. They've been real quiet about what's been happening along the border, which I understand because they're trying to keep some kind of ties with the Taliban. Not that they really probably care if they have good ties with the Taliban, but they certainly don't need any problems with them. So it's understandable why they would not talk too much about what happened to Dostum. He might have gone back to Turkey, I don't know, but he almost certainly went through Uzbekistan to get out of Afghanistan.
Okay, probably it might be possible to hide their presence for a little while, but what about those airplanes, those warplanes that we understand have gone to Central Asia, either to Uzbekistan, Tajikistan? How those things can be hidden for so long? I mean, where are they then? I mean,
actually, they can't hide them. And that's why we're pretty sure that they're there. Jane's Defense just did a story a couple days ago about this, and they had satellite photographs that showed all kinds of planes out there on the runway in Termez. There's a lot of interesting things going on with Uzbekistan right now that, people give them a lot of credit for having reached out to the Taliban and hosted, a delegation and met with them a bunch. And I'm sure, that, like I said, if nothing else, they just don't want problems with what's going on there. I don't think any of the governments in Central Asia are happy with the way that events have turned out. None of them want the Taliban as a neighbor. So why would the Uzbeks take the Afghan warplanes? There's a lot of reasons. One, because why would you want the Taliban to have them? Two, if you don't really support these people and you think that a day will come when someone will challenge them and maybe force them out, then it's good to have these planes right by the border, I suppose. One wonders that in all the conversations that certainly Uzbek officials have had with the U.S., everyone focused on the fact that the U.S. was supposedly asking to use bases in Central Asia. But that might be true, actually, but in a different way. They might have said, if they have to evacuate Afghanistan, would you take these aircraft at least, so that they don't end up in the hands of the Taliban, which seems to be what's happening. And if I would I just want to comment one thing on the refugees, if I could, real quick, too. I think it applies to both Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, is that, I have seen the stories, too, that there's as many as 1,500 refugees that crossed into Uzbekistan from Afghanistan recently. I think that's based on the Afghan ambassador to Uzbekistan, who was the first one to come up with that story. I've been down in the south at exactly this time of year on the Uzbek side of the border during a drought year, in 2000, and it would be pretty easy to cross the Amu Darya. It's not running very high at the moment. I don't know how much water is in it now, but I know when I was there in similar conditions at the same time of the year, you could have waded in and you wouldn't have been any higher than your waist or so. So a lot of them probably did come in, and people that saw these stories, we were going back and forth and speculating, why wouldn't the Uzbek government want to say that they're helping these people out? And we know that they've set up the tent camps down there. And the only thing that I could figure out is that they don't want to broadcast that this is a safe haven for Afghans, or they're afraid they'll be flooded with refugees from Afghanistan. And I think the same is true in Tajikistan. We really don't know how many people have come across the border, and I think it's in the government's interest not to talk about that too much. I don't think they're, like Turkmenistan just won't let them in. It's entire, this is another part about what's going on. It's so hard to penetrate the truth down there, because it probably is true that refugees are crossing. It wouldn't be that difficult to just go across the Amu Darya River, at least in the Uzbek section. But for whatever reason, the Uzbek government doesn't want to make that public, just like the planes. We know they're, because we've seen satellite photographs, but they don't want to talk about it.
Yeah, Erika, there are two questions that I would like to pose to you. One is the position that Central Asian authorities, at least two that we have spoken so far, Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, they seem to be struggling to take a kind of clear-cut position as to what has been happening so far at the border and their involvement, at least in the context of accepting refugees, which could be just a humanitarian gesture. I see just kind of confusing picture there. They want to say something, but they don't like to say something. In Uzbekistan's case, there has been at least three different statements which doesn't match to each other. Tajikistan is not coming forward to say something which is very clear, and looks like the Afghan embassies there. In the case of Uzbekistan, the AFP ran this story of 1,500 Afghans having crossed into Uzbekistan and currently living there in a tent city. That source is the Afghan embassy there. And also it is an Afghan embassy in Tajikistan which is providing information about what's going on in the border. So Central Asian authorities seems to be doesn't know what to do, how to react, and doesn't know what to say. And how do you read the situation? And also the second part of my question is, of course, there's a Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan is also part of Central Asia. What they have been saying, and what's your take on this kind of a very strange environment there in terms of the authorities' reaction?
So, I think it's not surprising that both Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, and to a much more greater extent Turkmenistan, are not transparent. This is the way that these governments operate. This is very normal for them. And of course, especially in situations like this, when they are caught by surprise, just like the rest of the world, or most of the world, was the quick advance of Taliban. I think this will continue.
So what's their calculation behind this lack of transparency there in this case?
Well, I think it's a way of presenting or not controlling the narrative that that there is a huge security challenge to those nations, and presenting a picture of, or an image of, a sense of control. And of course, those two countries, both Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, they're facing major political changes this year, and maybe next year for Tajikistan, or maybe this year. So in Uzbekistan, presidential elections are coming this October. Mirziyoyev cannot have this crisis in Afghanistan undermine his image of a strong leader, or the right leader for Uzbekistan today, so that there isn't just sheer fear among people of what will Uzbekistan now be facing with the Taliban-controlled Afghanistan. Because we need to remember that across Central Asia, there isn't really much understanding of what Taliban is among regular people. It's just this abstract, scary force, usually equated to groups like ISIS or Al-Qaeda that want to conquer much of the Muslim world without much nuance understanding what Taliban is. That is how local this phenomenon is to Afghanistan. And Tajikistan, of course, we now see where it's pretty obvious that Rahmon is about to transfer power to his 33-year-old son, and he too needs to present a sense of strong leader so that this transfer is smooth and successful. So every calculation in regards to Afghanistan today, handling the fallout of the crisis in Afghanistan, is made with these objectives in mind, that there are important events that are going to looming for both regimes in Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. In regards to countries like Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, they have the luxury of not really having to control their messaging because they don't share the border with Afghanistan. They don't see immediate repercussions of government officials or field commanders fleeing to their territories. They are, and also the societies in those countries, they are worried about developments in Afghanistan, but maybe not to the same extent as in Tajikistan and Uzbekistan. And their message has been somewhat tamed, and they did express concern with developments in Afghanistan, and also were more forward about in Kyrgyzstan allowing students to come study in Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan, allowing some UN agencies to relocate to Almaty. So their reaction is not as immediate and urgent or opaque as in Tajikistan and Uzbekistan.
Bruce, what about Turkmenistan? I mean, it's hard to imagine, like, if people are going to Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, even using illegal routes, as Pahlawan put out, citing to the Uzbek authorities that some of them have crossed illegally into Uzbekistan. I mean, Turkmenistan having the longest border with Afghanistan, I think it should be possible to cross into Turkmenistan illegally. In the meantime, Turkmenistan, of course, has been meeting with the Taliban officials in Doha and things like that. So where Turkmenistan stands in all this?
Well, neutral Turkmenistan, they're supposed to not have any position on this at all. You're right. Although Tajikistan has a longer border with Afghanistan than Turkmenistan does, but not that much of a difference actually. But it's a desert border in Turkmenistan. There's a lot of places they're like uninhabitable in areas. If you've ever been down along that border, there's places where there's a river a couple times, but a lot of places you don't know who goes wandering out there. But generally, what I've heard is if they see these people, they tell them they got to go back. They just don't want to get involved, with this at all. They don't want to have to take in refugees. They got a problem with letting foreigners into the country to begin with, and there's no way that I can imagine the Turkmen government would be willing to take in a large number of Afghan refugees. Unfortunately, I'm sure some have probably snuck into the country somehow or another, but they don't want to advertise that. And there's another point, and I know that Kaymars and Pahlawan will be able to back me up on this too. But because it's in social media in Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, but this has been a really bad time since the pandemic started, and Turkmenistan's economic conditions are not good anyway, even prior to the pandemic. And there's not much, while there's sympathy for what's happening to the people in Afghanistan, it seems certainly what I've heard from social networks with Uzbekistan and Tajikistan that people don't want the refugees to come over there. Because their lives are already really hard now. And the thought that all of a sudden they'd have all these other people competing for the basic resources that are available in these areas, it doesn't seem to be going over very well. Like I said, there's general sympathy for what's happening, but the idea of hosting refugees in the country is actually not popular in these countries. Even though it's, you could make the argument that international organizations would help them out, and a lot of people would like to get involved, but you kind of wonder that even if officials weren't guarding the border, what kind of welcome would a large group of refugees get if they managed to make it into some of these countries?
Very valid point there, Bruce. Turkmenistan is a unique case, but speaking of the other two neighboring countries, Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, though they don't deny acknowledging some Afghans having crossed into Central Asia, but they are also not confirming against all the odds that among them were some anti-Taliban leaders. So as long as, they remain in denial of them being present in the military hardware that are believed to have been transported to Central Asia, it's hard to discuss what the plans they might have about them going forward. But the fact is, whether Central Asians like or dislike Afghanistan is a local matter for them. They will be discussed in the context of Afghanistan going forward. They will have stake in what comes next in that country. The bottom line is the conflict across the border is no more foreign to them. As Bruce, you put it in your recent piece, that the Afghan conflict has spilled over to Central Asia. Actually, there are some signs which hints what direction they might be thinking about. I'm particularly pointing at the Afghan ambassador to Tajikistan as proactive media engagement there. I have no idea about the diplomatic protocol, but what I would like to think about is Tajik authorities are paying close attention to what he is doing. What has been happening at the embassy is remarkable. So I guess we will know more in days ahead, in very near future, as to what position that Central Asians might take going forward. Especially, there are early signs of uprising that's forming up in Panjshir Valley of Afghanistan against the Taliban. So in case if that formation takes a serious shape, I think we will be paying attention to what are some of the immediate realities that Central Asian countries will have to face, and what are some of the signs that will determine what comes next for Central Asia and what Central Asia do about it. So let's continue the conversation talking about these and many other questions very shortly. first, let me recap the debate that today on the Majlis podcast. I'm joined by Dr. Erika Marat, Assistant Professor at the National Defense University in Washington, D.C., Palawan Turgunov, the Managing Editor of Radio Free Liberties Uzbek Service, Kayumas Oto, a journalist with the Radio Free Liberties Tajik Service, Bruce Pannier, the Editor of Radio Free Liberties Central Asia blog, Kishlok Awazi. I'm Muhammad Tahir, host of the Majlis and Radio Free Liberties Media Manager here in Washington, D.C., and we are discussing the developments in Afghanistan from the lenses of Central Asia and what it might mean going forward. As Kayumars earlier, you kind of touched upon this. The interview that you guys had with the Afghan ambassador in Tajikistan, very, very interesting. I mean, at least in the pictures that you have posted on your website, it's shown that diplomats they are taking down President Ghani's pictures and replacing it with Amrullah Saleh's. It's very, very, very revealing as to how things might go from here. So, Kayurmas, any highlights from the interview that you guys have done with the ambassador other than that picture? And
Yes, the Afghan ambassador to Tajikistan had a press conference on 18th of August. Of course, he said that maybe many refugees on the future from Afghanistan. He added that the authorities of Tajikistan and other neighboring countries should be ready to accept them in accordance with their international obligations. When Tajik authorities remained silent, a voice came from Afghan embassy in Dushanbe city. As you say, that day, Afghan ambassador Zahir Aghbar not only accused President Ghani for taking $169 million of Afghan people and go to the abroad, but changed Ghani's photography with Amrullah Saleh photography. Zahir Aghbar, the Afghan ambassador in Dushanbe, said he recognized Saleh as the acting president of Afghanistan now. I think this was the only voice from Tajikistan in these days, but not from the side of the Tajik authorities. I want to say also here, Tajikistan is a very close country. Maybe the authorities don't want to divulge information. Maybe they don't want to intimidate Tajik people inside country. Or maybe Tajik authorities don't want to offend anyone, maybe in Afghanistan or in other countries, probably, I think.
Bruce, you also saw that interview, right? I mean, what stands out to you in that interview? I mean, I'm just kind of trying to drive the conversation towards something that is ahead of us that we yet to see.
Well, the fact that he seemed, at least for a while there, he was kind of the spokesman for the government that was chased from power. It's interesting that in Tajikistan's case, because he wasn't, Azadi was the first one, I think, to speak with him. But then after that, a bunch of, people saw that Azadi had interviewed him and a lot of people called and the Tajik government let it go. So, it kind of shows what position the Tajik government has on what's happening in Afghanistan right now, that they're clearly siding with the people who are in the Panjshir Valley at the moment, I would say. And Uzbekistan's not far behind. You don't hear about the Afghan ambassador, or I haven't heard about the Afghan ambassador in Pakistan saying anything. He might have fled for all I know. But the talking that's happening on behalf of the people who call themselves the legitimate government of Afghanistan, that were there before the Taliban came in, and they're pretty much all in the Panjshir Valley. But the voice for them is coming out of Central Asia, which is kind of interesting to me. That's where the people, their spokesmen, so to speak, are actually making their statements. I mean, they've got a little bit of a hold of it, and they're speaking in the Panjshir Valley. Now, like Ahmed Massoud, and I know that Azadi had spoken with him too. But, in the first days, it was the people it was ambassadors in Central Asia that were actually doing all the talking for what was going on with this rapidly formed resistance to the Taliban.
Yeah, Erika, I also wondered your thoughts about the Afghan ambassador to Tajikistan is kind of openly coming up and taking the position against the Taliban and siding with the group that the Afghan Tajiks are forming in Panjshir Valley in Afghanistan against the Taliban. This is the province which remains beyond the Taliban's control as we speak. And Afghan VP, some call him former VP, Amrullah Saleh, went there promising to give a fight on Taliban. So the fact that the Afghan ambassador in Tajikistan is openly siding with this anti-Taliban Afghan group, how significant is that in terms of the thinking among the Tajik authorities about Afghan affairs?
This is a very good question and interesting dynamics. So let me first of all say that Central Asian countries, the post-Soviet Central Asian countries, unlike Afghanistan's other neighbors, Pakistan, Iran, or other countries like China or Russia, Central Asian countries, they would never admit it publicly, but the states there were always interested in having U.S. and international coalition presence in Afghanistan for as long as possible. And the more we're able to align with the government under the international presence than the Taliban regime, of course. In regards to Tajikistan, I think, I agree with Bruce that this is a sign of where Tajikistan is likely to take stance against Taliban, not as accommodating as possibly Uzbekistan. And I think that we might see another extreme unfolding in Tajikistan, that it will be framed as an external enemy, as something that the country needs to be mobilized against. And of course, an image of an external threat is always consolidates ruling regimes and allows them to suppress opposition and centralize their control over government and over security structures.
Very interesting. And Palwan, I know you from with your analysis. Is there anything in a greater context you want to add in this? I mean, what I was trying to say here is like, yes, Uzbekistan is trying to say that, okay, this is not our thing. Whatever happens is outside the border in Afghanistan, and would not acknowledge any leaders coming in. And then those who have come to Uzbekistan so far would say, okay, they are illegally crossed, and some of them might have gone back or sent back to Afghanistan. I mean, is it really a sustainable strategy for Uzbekistan, and how do you see the Uzbekistan's position going forward in terms of what's happening in Afghanistan and what might come next in Afghanistan?
Well, Uzbek officials know that the presence of Dostum or Atanur Muhammad, former Northern Alliance commanders in Uzbekistan, as well as the accommodation of the Afghan military aircraft, would make Taliban angry. What was interesting, on the 16th of August, General Prosecutor Office of Uzbekistan first published a statement saying that 46 military aircraft crossed the border, and one of them even clashed with the Uzbek plane. But later, they have denied their own statement. As you know, during the Taliban's first rule between 1996 and 2001, although it has never officially accepted, Uzbekistan supports Dostum and the Northern Alliance, along with Tajikistan and Russia. In response, the Taliban support the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, which in turn creates a lot of problems for Tashkent. The Taliban has openly threatened Uzbekistan previously, stating that they will make an Islamic city of Bukhara, Islamic city as a capital of the Islamic Emirate. But this time, though we are seeing a more pragmatic approach from both sides, I believe that the Uzbek government and the Taliban have established an agreement, building good relations with the leaders of the group at the time, if you remember, when they were invited to Tashkent and Samarkand, with the regional governor of Samarkand presenting the Taliban members with various gifts. Currently, Uzbek officials are not commenting on the security threats at all, security threats coming from Afghanistan. They are stressing the importance of the implementation of regional projects which were discussed with the previous administration in Kabul. What was interesting, we had a statement from the director, the head of logistics center on the border with Afghanistan, who accused President Ghani's government blamed Ghani's government for widespread corruption in Afghanistan, saying that the Taliban dealt with the corruption better when they were in power back in 1990s. The fact that the Uzbek government did not rush to evacuate the embassy staff from Kabul, like Russia, demonstrates a certain level of trust between the two parties and suggests that the Uzbek government are ready to do business with the Taliban. Since 2018, Uzbekistan has been actively involved in talks with the Taliban in Doha, in Tashkent, in Moscow. And Taliban leaders made a number of commitments, insisting that they will not pose a threat to Uzbekistan. There was one statement from Mullah Abdul Ghani Baradar when he came to Tashkent in 2019, I think. And then he even said that he supports, the leadership of Taliban supports President Mirziyoyev's regional initiatives. It will be interesting to see whether they keep their promises now. For the time being, I think it seems that the Uzbek government is buying the Taliban's narrative that they have changed since they last ran Afghanistan 20 years ago.
They want to buy that. I guess all the other signs that are coming out of Afghanistan, and people would interpret whether they changed or not differently. And also, Taliban do say that they have no cross-border intentions, maybe giving good signals to Uzbekistan. And in the meantime, we also know that the Uzbek militants who used to be part of Islamic movement of Uzbekistan or part of other groups, they are still in Afghanistan. And Taliban now in control of all the areas where those militants are. And they are not doing anything about this. How it is going in Uzbekistan? How can they comprehend this situation? On one hand, Taliban say, okay, you are fine, we are no threat to you, but also keeping those militants there.
Yes, we know that remnants of the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, although their leaders were killed long time ago, and Al-Qaeda affiliate Uzbek groups operating inside Afghanistan, they are still present there. They still exist, with some of them who previously fought on the side of the Taliban. And I think they will continue to threaten Uzbekistan with a level of threat depending on the ability of the Taliban to control these groups and the whole country. Probably Taliban is saying behind the doors that these problems are in our control. We can control these groups. And there is also a certain level of romanticism of the Uzbek segment of social media regarding the Islamic image of the Taliban. I've seen comments saying that they are our Muslim brothers and they belong to the same Sunni branch and Hanafi school of Islam, and so on and so forth. However, the people of Uzbekistan have very little information about who the Taliban are, where they come from, and how they interpret Islamic Sharia law. Regardless of whether they openly sympathize with the hardline Taliban ideology or denounce them, analysts tend to think the Taliban viewpoint will penetrate the mainstream kind of Muslims, among mainstream Muslims in Uzbekistan in one form or another. In the long term, this could affect relations of the Uzbek government with its own Muslim population. Since the death of President Karimov, who was notoriously restrictive on not just political Islam or militancy, but any form of Islamic thought or ideology, often taking strong measures against any rise in religious movement or political Islam, let's say. We've seen Mirziyoyev's government take a more tolerant approach towards Islam. He's showing more patience towards religious symbols, such as allowing the adoption of the hijab and men, Uzbek men growing beards for religious purposes. Nonetheless, we don't know how the Uzbek government will react if faced with the same threats Karim's regime did from militant or extremist groups.
Erika, maybe this is a kind of big picture question to you. On one hand, it looks like those Central Asian authorities seem to take Taliban's statements on the face value, kind of saying, okay, they are fine with us. But on the other hand, you also see some sort of kind of anxiety on their behalf, at least in their actions, in terms of they are joining military drills with Russia just across the border in Central Asia. If you are okay with the Taliban, why you keep doing those kind of military drills? What is that for?
Right. I think just like for the rest of the world, it's really uncertain how Taliban will rule Afghanistan and what kind of internal challenges they will face. And all that is also part of the calculation, I think, for Uzbekistan and for Russia as well. I think Central Asian countries will need to project a stronger national security stance because Taliban is unlikely to be internationally recognized for a while. But also one thing that we didn't really talk about here, but something that will have to be discussed in the future is what will other groups inside Afghanistan, how will they behave, specifically ISIS Khorasan and Al-Qaeda. And we know that ISIS Khorasan has a lot of Uzbekistan natives who first joined ISIS in Syria and Iraq, now residing in Afghanistan. We don't really know how many there are currently in Afghanistan, but we know that there are Uzbekistan natives, there are Tajikistan natives, and depending on how ISIS-K will be able to sustain its activity in Afghanistan. I mean, we know that they just yesterday criticized Taliban and accused them of being Western puppets, and that they're not the true jihadis or Sharia, whatever, Muslim force in Afghanistan. So this dynamics is very interesting to observe, and I think that's something that's very much present and very much a concern for Uzbek government today. Those other groups operating in Afghanistan, and what will their natives, former or current citizens, depending on how they see them, what will they do? How will they find their role in this changing Afghanistan today?
Yeah. No, earlier we had another conversation about their current state in Afghanistan, and it looks like at least the experts who have joined our discussion on that podcast would say, I mean, they are pretty much, those Central Asian fighters in Afghanistan, they pretty much acting independently. They have their own source of income. They have their own areas and all this stuff. It looks like it's going to be an element that we should be watching going forward. And another dynamic that I will be watching at is when the time comes, whether to recognize the Taliban as the kind of legitimate government or not. What Central Asians do in that scenario, whether they will be among those countries who would recognize Taliban as a government. If not, what does that will say about their position? If yes, how to read that position? It's something that is coming up very soon, and we will, of course, when that happens, we will be back in this discussion. So we also need to be wrapping up the discussion. Bruce, maybe perhaps with you, Erika mentioned those Central Asians in Afghanistan as a potential area to be looked at. So what are the other dynamics you will be looking at as we go forward?
Erica mentioned a while ago that probably all those governments were really happy when the U.S. was there, and I always felt that was true too. The U.S., because it is far away, they were panicking when the Taliban were there before, and you could almost make the argument that the Central Asians benefited more than probably anybody from the U.S. operation in Afghanistan, because it really took the heat off their doorstep, and they were allowed to, for 20 years, they've been able to keep things going without worrying very much about what was happening south of the border. Okay, now the U.S. is gone, and people have made all kinds of points about, Russia's claiming it's a victory, China's laughing and stuff like that. I'm like, yeah, except now it's up to China and Russia to provide security for that border. The Central Asians don't have the U.S. anymore there. So who are they going to pick, and what combination, and how are they going to get this so that they get to, some level of comfort that their interests are going to be protected and they have allies that are going to help them out? Okay, clearly Russia's going to get more influence because they're the security guarantor of the region, and they have base Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. But how far does this cooperation go? And same with China. People are like, well, military cooperation will go up. And I'm like, well, I don't know, but the fact is the U.S. has been removed from the equation temporarily. And they were like the best security that Central Asia had just because they were so far away. Everyone knew they were bound to leave sooner or later. And they would leave Central Asia alone. But you start to let Russia and China in to help you out, and maybe you never get them out again. Or you become so dependent upon them and so beholden to them that you can't really cut ties with them anymore. Yeah. So it's going to be interesting to see how they deal with that and who they reach out to for help and such guarantees as you can get in this situation.
Yeah, very, very interesting point. And also another point that comes to my mind is, the group that is forming up in Panjshir Valley, mostly on the ethnic lines, the anti-Taliban group. So if that takes a kind of serious shape going forward, where Central Asia finds itself in that struggle, that's kind of another dynamic. Palawan, Kayumars, is there anything very briefly you would like to point out in terms of where your eyes will be going forward in terms of how things might proceed from here?
Yes, since we start with the influx of refugees, any influx of refugees to countries such as Uzbekistan will affect the mood in the society, will create problems for the countries like Uzbekistan or Tajikistan. And I think Central Asian governments are worried about economic consequences of the events in Afghanistan. The Financial Times reported last week that the price of Eurobond issued by the Uzbek government earlier this year have dropped significantly due to the security risks coming from Afghanistan. And as you know, Central Asian countries, none of them have kind of any influence on Afghanistan, any political leverage on Afghanistan. And they have benefited a lot during the past 20 years from being a member of so-called the coalition on war on terror. They benefited financially and politically. And on the other side, the idea of doing business with the Taliban is not new. If you remember, shortly before the 9/11 attacks in 2000, President Karim made a statement saying that the Taliban are no longer present a threat to the Uzbek border. And then former U.S. Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld visited Tashkent in October 2001 to secure the military base for operations against Taliban and Al-Qaeda. Karim said that he was approached by the official of the previous U.S. administration who attempted to convince him to support the pipeline project running through the Taliban-controlled territory in Afghanistan at that time. So they are worried about economic and financial consequences of the situation in Afghanistan as well as security implications, I think.
Right. Very good point. Kayurmas, if there is anything you would like to add, otherwise I'm going to end the conversation here.
About your question about who will be accepted the Taliban, I want to say really I don't know Tajikistan will accept the Taliban or not, but I think official Dushanbe now is waiting for a conclusion from Moscow, maybe Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan and China also. If it's possible, I want to say something here. Unlike the Tajik government, it's silent. Tajik people often discuss on social media, especially in Facebook, the situation in Afghanistan, our neighbor, and also its impact on Tajikistan. For example, yesterday I saw a group of commentators say the situation in Afghanistan is forcing the Tajik government to think or maybe to pay more attention about security inside country and in the border with Afghanistan too. But another group called for an end to corruption, nepotism, and pressure on opposition members, independent media, freedom of speech, freedom of religious, to prevent a repeat of the Afghanistan happening in Tajikistan.
Yeah, very interesting conversation. Of course, there are a lot to watch at, and whether Central Asia wants or not, it looks like the region is certainly at the center of a discussion when it comes to Afghanistan these days, and we will keep our eyes on as to what comes next. With this, thank you very much, Dr. Erika Marat, Assistant Professor at the National Defense University in Washington, D.C., Palawan Turgunov, the Managing Editor of Radio Free Liberties Uzbek Service, Kayumars Otto, a journalist with the Radio Free Liberties Tajik Service, and Bruce Pannier, the editor of Radio Free Liberties Central Asia blog Kishlok Owazi. Thank you, colleagues, for your time today. And this is from me, Muhammad Tahir, Radio Free Liberties Media Manager and host of the Majlis podcast here in Washington, D.C. Until next week, bye-bye.